Picture this scene if you can. You're 14 years old, standing completely naked in a freezing cold stone room. Strange women's hands are examining the most private parts of your body. The Duchess of Bedford watches you with cold, calculating eyes, while two midwives inspect you like you're livestock at a market. Your whole body is shaking, and it's not from the February cold coming through the walls of this French castle. No, you're shaking from pure terror. These women hold your entire future in their rough, weathered hands. One single word from them, one declaration that your body shows signs of being impure, and your life as you know it is over forever. You are not just any ordinary girl facing this nightmare. You are Blanche of Navarre, and you're supposed to become a queen. This examination will decide whether you live in luxury as royalty or whether you die in complete disgrace. Welcome back to my channel, everyone. If this is your first time here, I'm passionate about uncovering the hidden truths of history. The stories that textbooks often skip over because they're too disturbing or too uncomfortable for most people to hear. And today's story? Well, it's going to shock you to your core. Before we dive deep into these forgotten stories of survival and unimaginable suffering, I want to ask you to do me a huge favor. If you find yourself learning something new today, or if this content makes you think differently about history, please hit that like button. It really does help more people discover these important stories. And hey, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell, because we're going to explore more hidden truths that will change how you see the past. Also, I love connecting with viewers from around the world. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It absolutely amazes me that we can explore these ancient stories together from different countries, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about what really happened in the past. Now, what I'm about to tell you might sound like something from a horror movie, but every single detail you'll hear today actually happened. These weren't isolated incidents or rare punishments. They were standard, accepted procedures that happened to some of the most powerful women in medieval Europe. We're talking about queens, princesses, and noble ladies who had their bodies examined, tested, and violated in ways that would be considered torture today. And the most disturbing part? Society not only allowed this to happen, they demanded it. Today, we're going to uncover the horrifying world of medieval virginity testing. You'll learn about the brutal methods used to verify a woman's purity. You'll hear the actual stories of real women who endured these examinations. And you'll discover how these practices shaped politics, religion, and society for hundreds of years. This isn't just ancient history either. Some of these practices still happen today in various parts of the world. By understanding where they came from, we can better understand why they need to end. So settle in, because we're about to take a journey into one of the darkest chapters of medieval life, a chapter that most history books prefer to ignore. Let me paint you a picture of medieval Europe, because understanding this world is crucial to understanding why these horrific practices existed in the first place. Imagine living in a time where your entire family's future, their wealth, their land, their very survival depended on proving that children were actually related to their fathers. This wasn't just about family pride or reputation. In medieval Europe, inheritance was literally a matter of life and death. See, here's the thing about medieval society that's hard for us to understand today. There was no DNA testing. There were no blood tests. There was no scientific way to prove who a child's father really was. And in a world where everything, land, titles, wealth, political power, passed from father to legitimate son, this created a massive problem. Think about it from a medieval king's perspective for a moment. You've spent your entire life building an empire. You've fought wars, made alliances, accumulated vast amounts of land and treasure. When you die, you want all of that to go to your son, your actual biological son, not some other man's child who just happened to be born to your wife. But how can you be absolutely certain that your wife's children are really yours? In medieval times, there was only one way that people believed they could guarantee this: marry a virgin and make sure she stays faithful to you alone. This obsession with female virginity wasn't just about morality or religion, though those played huge roles too. It was fundamentally about economics and political power. A woman's virginity became the most valuable commodity she possessed. More valuable than gold, more precious than jewels, more I am. Medieval Europe was built on what historians call a blood and breeding system. Your worth as a person was determined by who your parents were and who you could marry. Noble families spent generations carefully planning marriages to combine wealth, create political alliances, and ensure that their bloodlines remained pure. In this system, women were essentially treated as walking, talking inheritance contracts. Their primary value wasn't as human beings with thoughts, feelings, and dreams. Their value was as vessels for producing legitimate heirs who could inherit property and continue family lines. Now, you might be wondering, why was virginity specifically so important? Why not just trust women to be faithful after marriage? Well, medieval society had some pretty twisted ideas about female sexuality that made virginity seem like the only guarantee of future faithfulness. Medieval men believed that once a woman had sex with one man, she would crave sex with all men. They thought that losing virginity was like opening a door that could never be closed again. A woman who had already had sexual experience was seen as someone who couldn't control her desires, and therefore couldn't be trusted to remain faithful to one husband. This belief was reinforced by religious teachings that portrayed women as inherently weak, sinful, and unable to resist temptation. The medieval Christian church taught that women were basically walking temptations who led men astray, and that the only pure women were those who had never experienced sexual desire. These ideas created a society where women lived under constant suspicion. Even the most powerful queens and princesses were viewed as potential threats to the stability of kingdoms simply because they were female. Their bodies became battlegrounds where politics, religion, and economics clashed in the most intimate and violating ways possible. The stakes were absolutely enormous. We're talking about kingdoms, empires, and vast fortunes that could be lost or gained based on whether people believed a woman was pure. International wars were fought over disputed inheritances. Entire royal dynasties rose and fell based on questions about legitimate heirs. When a royal marriage was arranged, it wasn't just two people getting married. It was two countries or regions forming an alliance. Massive dowries changed hands. We're talking about amounts of money that would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars today. Trade agreements were signed, military alliances were formed, treaties were negotiated. All of this depended on the marriage producing legitimate heirs that both sides could accept. And the only way medieval society believed they could guarantee legitimate heirs was to start with a virgin bride whose purity could be verified and then closely monitored throughout her marriage. This created an impossible situation for women. They were expected to be completely innocent and pure, but also sophisticated enough to navigate complex political situations. They were supposed to be desirable enough to attract powerful husbands, but not so desirable that other men might pursue them. They were required to produce children quickly to prove their fertility, but any sign of sexual knowledge or desire was seen as evidence of impurity. The pressure was absolutely crushing. Imagine knowing that your value as a person, your family's honor, your country's political stability, and your own physical safety all depended on the condition of one small part of your body that could be damaged by something as simple as riding a horse or doing physical labor. Medieval women lived in constant fear that they might accidentally do something that would damage their hymens and therefore their reputations. They avoided certain activities, restricted their movements, and lived under constant surveillance to ensure that nothing could cast doubt on their purity. But even living the most careful, restricted life possible wasn't enough to guarantee safety. Because medieval society didn't just assume that virgin brides would remain pure. They demanded proof. Regular, invasive, humiliating proof that often continued throughout a woman's entire marriage. This demand for proof led to the development of increasingly elaborate and degrading testing methods. What started as simple examinations evolved into complex procedures that combined primitive medical knowledge with superstition, creating a system of abuse that was both systematic and sanctioned by the highest authorities in medieval society. The women who would become subjects of these tests weren't random peasants or criminals. They were princesses, queens, and noble ladies, the most privileged women in medieval society. If these powerful, protected women couldn't escape this treatment, imagine what life was like for women with less status and protection. This is the world where our story takes place. A world where women's bodies were treated as political documents to be read, interpreted, and verified by others. A world where the most intimate aspects of female experience became matters of state policy and international diplomacy. Now that you understand why medieval society was obsessed with female virginity, let me tell you about the absolutely insane methods they developed to test it. And when I say insane, I mean procedures so bizarre and unscientific that they would be laughable if they weren't so cruel and damaging to the women who endured them. The most obvious method, and the one that most people think of when they hear about virginity testing, was the physical examination of the hymen. Medieval doctors and midwives would examine women's genitals, looking for an intact hymen as proof of virginity. But here's what makes this particularly cruel. Medieval people had almost no understanding of female anatomy. They didn't know that hymens come in different shapes and thicknesses. They didn't understand that hymens can be stretched or torn by completely innocent activities, like horseback riding, physical labor, or even just normal physical development. Some women are born with very little hymenal tissue, while others have hymens that remain largely intact even after sexual activity. None of these biological facts mattered to medieval examiners. An absent or damaged hymen was automatically interpreted as evidence of sexual activity, regardless of the actual cause. This meant that innocent women could fail these tests through no fault of their own, while women who had actually had sex might pass if their anatomy happened to be different. But the physical examination was just the beginning. Medieval minds, twisted by superstition and desperate to find foolproof methods of testing, came up with procedures that sound more like something from a fantasy novel than real medical practice. Let me tell you about the sieve test, because this one perfectly shows how absurd these methods could get. Medieval people believed that a true virgin had special powers that would allow her to hold water in a sieve. You know, a kitchen strainer with holes in it. The idea was that pure, virginal hands could somehow magically prevent water from leaking through the holes. Picture this scene. A noble lady, perhaps a princess, about to be married, standing in front of a crowd of male observers, desperately trying to keep water from pouring through a kitchen tool, while her entire future depends on her success. The humiliation was intentional. The impossibility of the task was irrelevant. What mattered was creating a test that would break women's spirits while giving men the illusion of scientific proof. Some clever women found ways to cheat this test by coating the inside of the sieve with lanolin or other substances that could temporarily block the holes. But getting caught cheating was often worse than simply failing the test. Women who were discovered trying to fake results faced accusations of deception and fraud that could result in execution. Even more bizarre were the urine tests. Medieval physicians convinced themselves that they could determine a woman's virginity by examining her bodily fluids. They claimed that virgin urine was clear and lucid, sometimes white, sometimes sparkling. They believed they could tell if a woman was pure by listening to the sound her urine made when it hit a chamber pot. Imagine the degradation of noble ladies, daughters of kings and queens, being forced to urinate in front of male physicians who claimed they could hear virtue in the sound of water hitting pottery. These weren't quick, private examinations either. Women were often required to produce urine samples multiple times, with different doctors observing and debating the results. Some tests bordered on the occult. Medieval writers described using magnets to test women's fidelity. The idea was that if you placed a magnet under the head of a married woman while she slept, it would make a faithful wife embrace her husband more closely, while an unfaithful wife would suddenly jump out of bed because of frightening visions. This magnet test reveals something important about medieval thinking. They genuinely believed that moral qualities like virginity and faithfulness had physical properties that could be detected and measured. They thought purity was literally a substance that could be tested for, like checking the quality of metal or cloth. Perhaps the most dangerous tests were the fumigation procedures. Medieval physicians would cover women with cloth and then expose them to burning coal or other toxic fumes. They believed that virgins wouldn't smell the odor through their mouths and noses, while non-virgins would react to the fumes. Think about what this means. Women were literally being poisoned with smoke, while doctors watched their reactions. Some of these fumigation tests probably killed women or caused permanent lung damage. But the risk to women's health was considered less important than getting answers about their sexual history. The women who performed many of these examinations were midwives, women who should have understood female anatomy and sympathized with other women's suffering. But the social pressure on midwives was enormous. Their livelihoods depended on satisfying male authorities who demanded clear, definitive answers about women's purity. Some midwives did try to protect other women by lying about test results. There are historical records of midwives declaring women to be virgins when they clearly weren't, essentially covering up evidence that could have destroyed lives. These acts of sisterhood and resistance required incredible courage, because midwives who were caught lying faced severe punishment. But most midwives were honest in their examinations, partly because they genuinely believed in the importance of the tests, and partly because the consequences of being caught in a lie were so severe. This created a heartbreaking situation where women became instruments of other women's oppression. The tools used for these examinations were often crude and painful. Medieval medical instruments were nothing like modern equipment. Examinations were conducted with rough metal tools, in cold, unsanitary conditions, often causing additional pain and injury to women who were already traumatized by the experience. Multiple witnesses usually observed these examinations to prevent fraud or ensure accuracy. Women weren't allowed privacy, even during their most vulnerable moments. Court officials, male physicians, noble ladies, and servants might all be present during an examination, turning an already traumatic experience into a public spectacle. The examination process could last for hours. Different practitioners would take turns examining the same woman, checking and double-checking results. Women were positioned in degrading poses and forbidden from speaking or showing emotion during the process. They were expected to remain silent and passive while strangers violated their bodies. Some examinations were repeated multiple times, over days or weeks. If initial results were unclear or disputed, women might be subjected to the same tests over and over again. Each examination was as traumatic as the first, but women had no choice but to submit repeatedly until authorities were satisfied with the results. The documentation of these examinations was meticulous and degrading. Court scribes recorded detailed descriptions of women's bodies, noting the condition of their hymens, their reactions during testing, and the opinions of various examiners. These records were preserved for years, sometimes decades, ensuring that the humiliation of a single examination would follow women throughout their lives. The geographic reach of these practices was enormous. From England to Spain, from France to the Germanic regions, similar testing methods were used across medieval Europe. Royal courts shared information about examination techniques and compared results. This created a network of institutionalized abuse that transcended national boundaries. Different regions developed their own variations and specialties. Some areas focused more on physical examinations, while others emphasized the magical or supernatural tests. But the underlying assumption was universal. Women's bodies were appropriate subjects for male inspection and control. The religious justification for these practices made resistance particularly difficult. Medieval Christianity taught that the body was a temple of the Holy Spirit, but it simultaneously treated women's bodies as crime scenes to be investigated. Women who protested these examinations could be accused of pride, disobedience, or even heresy for refusing to submit to what authorities claimed was God's will. Now, let me tell you the actual stories of real women who lived through these nightmarish examinations. These aren't fictional characters or anonymous historical figures. These are documented cases of queens, princesses, and noble ladies whose most private moments became matters of public record. Let's start with Blanche of Navarre, whose story I mentioned at the beginning. The year was 1453, and after 13 years of marriage to Henry IV of Castile, Blanche faced an official examination that would confirm her virginity. Think about that for a moment. 13 years of marriage, and she was still a virgin. 13 years of sharing a bed with a man who never touched her. 13 years of humiliation disguised as royal matrimony. 13 years of whispered rumors about what was wrong with her, or with him, or with their relationship. Now, at 29 years old, she would be stripped naked and examined by strangers to prove what her body had endured in silence. Blanche's situation reveals the impossible position of medieval royal women. Her marriage had been arranged to create a political alliance between Navarre and Castile. But when the marriage failed to produce heirs, both kingdoms faced a crisis. Was the problem with Blanche's fertility? Was Henry unable to consummate the marriage? These questions had enormous political implications that went far beyond the personal suffering of two individuals. The examination that Blanche underwent was conducted by multiple midwives under the supervision of court officials. She was stripped completely naked and placed on a table like a piece of livestock being evaluated for purchase. The midwives probed her body with their fingers, searching for evidence of sexual activity. They examined her hymen, checked for signs of recent injury or healing, and questioned her about her physical experiences. The examination confirmed that Blanche was indeed still a virgin after 13 years of marriage. But rather than being a vindication, this confirmation became evidence that could be used against her. If she was still pure after 13 years with a husband, perhaps there was something wrong with her that made her unsuitable for marriage and childbearing. After the examination, Blanche was sent back to Navarre in disgrace. She had proven her purity, but at the cost of her youth, her dignity, and any hope of a normal married life. Her story shows how even successful virginity tests could destroy women's lives. The very process of being tested marked women as problematic, regardless of the results. Catherine of Aragon's ordeal is perhaps even more famous and politically significant. When Henry VIII decided he wanted to annul their marriage in the 1520 seconds, Catherine's virginity became a weapon in international political warfare. Catherine insisted until her dying day that she had come to Henry's bed as a virgin, having never truly consummated her first marriage to Henry's brother Arthur. For years, this proud Spanish princess found her most intimate physical experiences dissected by theologians, lawyers, and politicians who cared nothing for her dignity and everything for their political goals. Henry needed to prove that Catherine had consummated her marriage to Arthur in order to argue that their marriage violated divine law and was therefore invalid. The examinations Catherine underwent were particularly cruel because they were conducted multiple times over several years. Each time Henry's case seemed to weaken, new examinations were ordered. Catherine was forced to submit to intimate questioning and physical inspection repeatedly, with different teams of examiners checking and rechecking the same evidence. Court records from Catherine's case include detailed testimony about her wedding night with Arthur, descriptions of the bedsheets the morning after their wedding, and invasive questions about her physical development and sexual knowledge. These records were read aloud in public hearings, where Catherine had to listen to intimate details of her body being discussed by men who had never met her. The political implications of Catherine's case extended across Europe. Her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, threatened war against England if Henry succeeded in annulling the marriage. The Pope faced enormous pressure from both sides. Catherine's hymen became a diplomatic crisis that affected the balance of power between major European kingdoms. Joan of Arc's experience shows how virginity testing extended beyond marriage politics into questions of divine authority and religious legitimacy. Joan claimed to receive visions from God, directing her to save France from English conquest. But medieval Christianity taught that God was more likely to speak through pure, virgin women than through those who had been corrupted by sexual experience. Before Joan was allowed to meet with the French court and present her case for leading military campaigns, she had to undergo examination to verify her virginity. The test was conducted by noble ladies under the supervision of the Duchess of Bedford. Joan was stripped naked and examined just like any other woman whose purity was in question. The examination confirmed Joan's virginity, which was taken as evidence that her religious visions might be genuine. But think about the implications of this. Joan's courage, her intelligence, her military knowledge, and her passionate commitment to France meant nothing compared to the condition of her hymen. Her spiritual authority was considered inseparable from her sexual purity. Later, when Joan was captured by English forces and put on trial for heresy, her virginity was examined again. Her prosecutors understood that if they could prove she was no longer a virgin, they could undermine her claims to divine inspiration. Even as Joan faced charges that would lead to her execution, even as she endured months of theological interrogation designed to break her spirit, she was subjected to the same degrading physical examinations that every woman of importance faced. The irony was crushing. Joan, who had inspired French armies to victory, who had changed the course of the 100 Years' War through her leadership, who had shown more courage than most of the men around her, was reduced to lying naked on a table, while noble ladies examined her body for evidence of her spiritual worthiness. These examinations were documented in detail in Joan's trial records. The scribes who recorded the proceedings saw no contradiction between respecting Joan as a potential messenger of God and treating her body as evidence in a legal proceeding. They described her physical condition with the same clinical detachment they used for discussing theological questions. Joan's story reveals how virginity testing served multiple purposes beyond determining sexual purity. It was a method of asserting male control over women who challenged traditional gender roles. Joan had stepped far outside the boundaries of acceptable female behavior by claiming divine authority and demanding military command. The examinations reminded her and everyone else that no matter how exceptional her achievements, she was still subject to male judgment and control. The international implications of these royal examinations were enormous. When a queen's virginity was questioned, it could trigger diplomatic crises that affected multiple countries. Trade agreements could be cancelled, military alliances dissolved, and wars declared based on the results of intimate examinations. Consider the case of Isabella of Valois, who was married to Richard II of England when she was only 6 years old. When Richard was deposed and killed, Isabella's virginity became a crucial political question. Her purity would determine whether she could be remarried to create new political alliances, or whether she would be considered damaged goods, unsuitable for further diplomatic marriages. Isabella underwent examination while still a child, subjected to the same invasive procedures used on adult women. The examiners had to determine not only her current condition, but also make predictions about her future suitability for marriage and childbearing. A child's body became the subject of adult political calculations that would determine her entire future. The psychological trauma these women endured was immense and lasting. Modern understanding of trauma makes clear that these examinations constituted severe sexual abuse that would have caused symptoms similar to what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Women who underwent these tests often reported lasting problems with intimacy, trust, and their relationship with their own bodies. Some women developed elaborate coping mechanisms to survive repeated examinations. They learned to dissociate mentally during the procedures, to control their emotional reactions, and to present themselves as cooperative subjects rather than unwilling victims. These survival strategies required tremendous psychological strength, but they came at enormous personal cost. The documentation of these women's suffering reveals the systematic nature of the abuse they endured. Court records don't just describe the examination procedures, they also record women's reactions, their attempts to maintain dignity during violation, and the cold calculations of male observers who treated human suffering as administrative data. Reading these historical records today is both heartbreaking and infuriating. The casual way that scribes recorded intimate details of women's bodies, the matter-of-fact descriptions of procedures that constituted torture, and the complete absence of concern for women's emotional well-being reveal a society that had fundamentally dehumanized half its population. Yet, these same records also preserve evidence of women's resistance and resilience. Between the lines of official documentation, we can see women supporting each other, midwives showing mercy when possible, and victims maintaining their dignity even in the most degrading circumstances. Their courage in the face of systematic abuse continues to inspire people fighting against injustice today. Now, let's talk about what happened after the engagement examinations were complete and royal weddings actually took place. Because, for medieval women, surviving the pre-marriage virginity test was just the beginning of their nightmare. The wedding night itself became another form of examination, another opportunity for their bodies to be scrutinized and judged. Picture this scenario, which played out countless times across medieval Europe. A young princess, maybe 14, 15, 16 years old, has just gone through an elaborate wedding ceremony. She's wearing expensive clothes, surrounded by hundreds of guests, participating in festivities that celebrate what's supposed to be the happiest day of her life. But as the evening progresses and the guests begin to drink more wine and make increasingly crude jokes, she starts to realize that her ordeal is far from over. The wedding feast isn't just a celebration, it's a prelude to another kind of performance, where her body will once again be the star of the show. Medieval wedding customs required that the marriage be consummated, meaning the bride and groom had to have sex before the union was considered legally valid. But it wasn't enough for this to happen privately between the couple. Medieval society demanded proof that consummation had actually occurred. The most common form of proof was the bloody bedsheets. Medieval people believed that when a virgin had sex for the first time, her hymen would tear and she would bleed onto the bed linens. These bloodstains became crucial evidence that the marriage had been properly consummated and that the bride had indeed been a virgin. So imagine you're that young princess on your wedding night. You know that in the morning, servants will rush into your bedroom to examine the sheets for blood. They'll look for specific patterns and amounts of staining. They'll preserve the stained fabric as evidence. In some cases, the bloody sheets would be displayed to wedding guests as proof of successful consummation. The pressure on both the bride and groom was enormous. The groom had to perform sexually while knowing that evidence of his performance would be examined and judged. The bride had to bleed the right amount, enough to prove her virginity, but not so much as to suggest injury or violence. This system created a horrifying set of incentives around what should have been an intimate moment between newlyweds. Instead of focusing on each other's comfort and pleasure, Couples had to think about producing the right kind of evidence for the morning examination. Some couples developed elaborate strategies to ensure they would pass the sheet test. They would have animal blood ready to apply to the linens if the woman didn't bleed naturally. They would coordinate stories about their wedding night experience. They would practice positioning themselves to maximize the chances of visible blood stains. For women who weren't actually virgins, the wedding night became an elaborate deception, requiring careful preparation and tremendous courage. Medieval literature preserves several methods that women used to fake virginity during consummation. One common technique involved using leeches, yes, actual blood-sucking worms, to create wounds that would bleed during intercourse. Women would apply leeches to their genital area the day before their wedding, allowing the creatures to feed on their blood and create small wounds that would reopen during sex. Think about the desperation this reveals. Women were willing to deliberately wound themselves in their most sensitive areas, to endure the pain of leeches feeding on their flesh, all to create the illusion of virginity during their wedding night. The physical pain must have been excruciating, but it was preferable to the consequences of failing the blood test. Other women used vials of animal blood, usually from chickens or other birds that were butchered for wedding feasts, hidden in jewelry or clothing that could be secretly applied to bedsheets during the night. This required incredible planning and coordination, often with the help of sympathetic servants or female relatives. Some women timed their weddings to coincide with their menstrual periods, hoping that natural bleeding would mask any absence of hymenal blood. This was risky because menstrual blood looked and smelled different from hymenal bleeding, and experienced midwives could often tell the difference. The most elaborate deceptions involved substitute brides. In some documented cases, women who weren't virgins arranged for other women, servants, sisters, or friends to take their places during the wedding night consummation. This required enormous trust and coordination, and the penalties for getting caught were severe for everyone involved. The morning after examination was conducted with the same clinical detachment as pre-wedding virginity tests. Servants would strip the bed and examine every stain on the sheets. They would look for specific colors, patterns, and amounts of blood. They would smell the stains to verify their authenticity. They would question both the bride and groom about their experiences. The bloody sheets themselves became political documents. In royal marriages, the stained linens were sometimes preserved for years as proof of legitimate consummation. They could be produced as evidence in legal proceedings if the marriage was ever challenged. Some stained sheets were even sent to foreign courts as diplomatic proof that political alliances had been properly sealed through consummated marriage. The servants who conducted these examinations were trained to look for signs of deception. They knew how fresh blood differed from old blood, how human blood differed from animal blood, and how hymenal bleeding typically appeared compared to other sources of vaginal blood. Women who failed the morning examination faced immediate consequences. Depending on the culture and circumstances, failed tests could result in the marriage being declared invalid, the woman being returned to her family in disgrace, or even execution for fraud and deception. Even women who passed the test weren't necessarily safe. The amount and pattern of bleeding could be interpreted in different ways. Too much blood might suggest that the groom had been violent or clumsy. Too little blood might indicate that the woman hadn't really been a virgin. The perfect amount of blood in the right pattern was a narrow target that many women missed through no fault of their own. The psychological impact of these wedding night examinations was devastating. What should have been an intimate moment of connection between newlyweds became a performance designed to satisfy the expectations of observers who would judge their most private experiences. Many women reported feeling disconnected from their own bodies after wedding night examinations. They learned to view their physical experiences as evidence to be managed rather than sensations to be enjoyed. This disconnection often lasted throughout their marriages, affecting their ability to develop healthy, intimate relationships with their husbands. The men involved in these marriages faced their own psychological pressures. They had to perform sexually while knowing that their performance would be evaluated and judged. They had to balance their own desires with the need to produce appropriate evidence. Many grooms reported feeling more like actors in a play than husbands consummating their marriages. Some husbands collaborated with their wives to fake evidence when necessary. They understood that their wives' lives might depend on producing bloody sheets, even if the women weren't actually virgins. These collaborations required trust and communication that many medieval marriages lacked, but they also created bonds between couples who shared secrets that could destroy them both if discovered. The wedding night examination system also created opportunities for blackmail and manipulation. Servants who discovered evidence of deception could use their knowledge to extract money, favors, or political influence from vulnerable couples. This created additional layers of fear and vulnerability around what was already a traumatic experience. Religious authorities played complex roles in these wedding night rituals. The same priests who blessed the marriages and preached about the sanctity of matrimony also participated in systems that reduced newlywed couples to performers in degrading spectacles. They justified these practices through theological arguments about the importance of legitimate heirs and pure bloodlines. The international implications of failed wedding night tests could be enormous. Royal marriages that couldn't be proven to have been consummated could be declared invalid, nullifying carefully negotiated political alliances and trade agreements. Wars were sometimes fought over disputes that began with questions about bloody bedsheets. The documentation of these wedding night examinations reveals the systematic nature of medieval society's obsession with controlling female sexuality. Court records describe not just the presence or absence of blood, but the specific appearance, smell, and location of stains. The clinical detail of these descriptions shows how thoroughly women's most intimate experiences had been transformed into administrative data. Now I want to dive into the absolutely bizarre medical science behind these virginity tests, because understanding how medieval people justified these practices reveals just how twisted their thinking had become. What's particularly disturbing is that many of these methods were developed by the most educated people in medieval society. Doctors, scholars, and religious authorities who genuinely believed they were practicing legitimate medicine. Medieval medical knowledge was a strange mixture of classical Greek and Roman texts, Islamic medical treatises, Christian theology, and pure superstition. Most medieval physicians had never actually studied female anatomy in any systematic way. They based their understanding on ancient texts written by men who had their own misconceptions about women's bodies. The fundamental problem was that medieval medicine treated the human body as a reflection of moral and spiritual qualities. They believed that physical characteristics could reveal a person's inner nature, moral status, and spiritual condition. This meant that determining virginity wasn't just about medical examination. It was about reading the body like a text that could reveal hidden truths about a woman's character. Let me tell you about some of the specific scientific methods that medieval physicians developed, because they reveal just how far educated people were willing to go to convince themselves they could objectively measure something that was fundamentally unmeasurable. The urine tests were particularly elaborate. Medieval physicians wrote detailed treatises explaining how virgin urine differed from non-virgin urine. They claimed that pure women produced clearer, more sparkling fluid that behaved differently when it hit surfaces or was exposed to different substances. One 13th century medical text called De Secretis Mulierum, on the secrets of women, stated with complete confidence that the urine of virgins is clear and lucid, sometimes white, sometimes sparkling. Another physician recommended that examiners listen carefully to the sound a woman made while urinating, claiming that a virgin urinates with a subtle hiss and indeed takes longer than a small boy. Think about what this means. Medical professionals were training other physicians to diagnose virginity based on the sound of women urinating. They were developing detailed criteria for evaluating the appearance, smell, and behavior of urine as it related to sexual experience. They were treating bathroom sounds as medical data. These urine tests required women to perform intimate bodily functions in front of male physicians who would observe, listen, and take notes on their performance. The humiliation was systematic and deliberate, disguised as legitimate medical practice. The fumigation tests were even more dangerous and absurd. Physicians would cover women with cloths and then expose them to burning coals, toxic herbs, or other harmful fumes. They believed that virgins would react differently to these substances than non-virgins. Niccolo Falcucci, a 15th century Italian physician, wrote that if a woman is covered with a piece of cloth and fumigated with the best coal, if she is a virgin, she does not perceive its odor through her mouth and nose. This test essentially involved poisoning women with smoke, while doctors watched for their reactions to determine their sexual history. The physical danger of fumigation tests was enormous. Carbon monoxide poisoning from burning coals could cause permanent brain damage or death. Toxic herbs could damage women's lungs, eyes, and other organs. But medieval physicians were so convinced of their methods that they were willing to risk women's lives to get answers about virginity. The sieve test represented another category of medieval medical thinking that combined primitive physics with magical beliefs. Physicians genuinely believed that virginity gave women special powers that would allow them to temporarily suspend natural laws. They thought pure women could somehow prevent water from flowing through holes by the sheer force of their moral condition. This test reveals the fundamentally magical thinking that underlay medieval medicine. Despite their claims to scientific authority, medieval physicians were essentially practicing a form of witchcraft that treated moral qualities as physical forces that could manipulate the natural world. Some tests involved examining women's reactions to precious stones, metals, or other substances that were believed to have special properties. The magnet test that I mentioned earlier was based on the belief that certain minerals could reveal hidden truths about people's moral condition by affecting their behavior while they slept. Medieval physicians also developed elaborate theories about how virginity affected women's overall health and physical development. They believed that sexual experience changed women's body temperature, altered their pulse rate, affected their digestion, and modified their sensory perception. These theories led to tests that examined everything from women's eye color to their skin texture to their voice quality as potential indicators of sexual experience. Physicians would spend hours examining women's entire bodies, looking for any physical sign that might reveal their sexual history. The most disturbing aspect of medieval medical virginity testing was its claims to objectivity and scientific authority. Physicians presented their methods as empirical observations based on careful study and documented evidence. They wrote lengthy treatises explaining their techniques, comparing different approaches, and refining their methods based on accumulated experience. This gave these practices a veneer of legitimacy that made them extremely difficult to challenge. Women who questioned the validity of virginity tests weren't just challenging social customs, they were questioning the authority of medical science itself, which was considered tantamount to heresy. Medieval medical education included formal training in virginity testing techniques. Young physicians learned these methods alongside other medical procedures. They were taught to view women's bodies as appropriate subjects for detailed investigation and to overcome any natural reluctance to violate women's privacy. This training created entire generations of medical professionals whose careers depended on their willingness to examine women's bodies. They developed expertise in techniques that had no legitimate medical value but enormous political and social importance. They became specialized instruments of oppression while genuinely believing they were serving scientific and moral purposes. The international exchange of medical knowledge ensured that virginity testing techniques spread across Europe and beyond. Physicians in different countries shared information about their methods, compared results, and collaborated on refining their approaches. This created a unified system of abuse that transcended national and cultural boundaries. Medical texts describing virginity testing techniques were preserved in libraries and universities for centuries. These works were studied by scholars who treated them as legitimate medical knowledge. The academic prestige of these texts helped normalize and perpetuate practices that were fundamentally about controlling women rather than advancing medical understanding. The economic incentives supporting medical virginity testing were substantial. Physicians who specialized in these examinations were well compensated for their services. Courts paid premium rates for medical experts who could provide definitive answers about women's sexual history. This created financial incentives for developing increasingly elaborate and expensive testing procedures. The religious integration of medical virginity testing made resistance particularly difficult. Medieval Christianity taught that God had created women's bodies in ways that would reveal their moral condition to trained observers. Questioning medical virginity tests wasn't just challenging scientific authority. It was questioning divine design itself. Some physicians did recognize the fundamental problems with virginity testing, but they were reluctant to speak out against practices that were so deeply embedded in medieval society. A few medical texts from the later medieval period contain subtle criticisms of standard testing methods, but these voices were largely ignored or suppressed. The legacy of medieval medical virginity testing extended far beyond the medieval period itself. These practices established precedents for medical control over women's bodies that influenced medical education and practice for centuries. The idea that women's reproductive systems were appropriate subjects for male medical authority became deeply embedded in medical culture. Modern medical professionals who study the history of their field are often shocked by the systematic nature of medieval virginity testing and its integration into mainstream medical practice. These historical practices serve as reminders of how easily medical authority can be used to justify abuse when it's not balanced by respect for human dignity and patient rights. Despite the overwhelming power of the system arrayed against them, medieval women were not passive victims. They developed sophisticated networks of resistance, elaborate methods of deception, and remarkable strategies for survival that reveal their intelligence, courage, and determination to maintain some control over their own lives. Let me tell you about the underground world of female resistance that existed alongside the official system of virginity testing. This was a hidden network of knowledge, support, and practical assistance that women created to help each other survive in an impossible situation. The most basic form of resistance was sharing information. Women who had undergone examinations would quietly pass along details about what to expect, how different examiners conducted their tests, and what kinds of responses were most likely to satisfy male authorities. This information network operated entirely through word of mouth, often between women who barely knew each other, but were united by their shared vulnerability. Older women who had survived multiple examinations became informal mentors for younger women facing their first tests. They would teach them how to control their emotional reactions, how to position their bodies to minimize pain during examinations, and how to present themselves as cooperative subjects rather than resistant victims. The most elaborate resistance strategies involved actively deceiving the examination system. Medieval literature preserves several methods that women used to fake virginity when necessary, and these techniques required extensive knowledge, careful planning, and extraordinary courage. The leech method that I mentioned earlier was one of the most ingenious and horrifying deception techniques. Women would deliberately apply blood-sucking leeches to their genital area, allowing the creatures to feed until they created small wounds that would reopen and bleed during sexual intercourse or examination. Think about what this procedure involved. A woman would have to obtain leeches. Not easy in medieval times, when such creatures were primarily used for legitimate medical treatments. She would have to apply them to her most sensitive body parts and endure the pain of them feeding on her blood. She would have to time this procedure carefully to ensure the wounds were fresh but partially healed during her examination or wedding night. The physical pain must have been excruciating, Leeches inject anticoagulants that prevent blood from clotting, so the wounds they create continue bleeding for extended periods. Women who use this method were essentially torturing themselves to create evidence of virginity that could save their lives. But even more remarkable than the physical courage this required was the psychological strength needed to inflict such pain on themselves while maintaining the appearance of innocence and purity that medieval society demanded. These women had to become accomplished actresses, hiding their pain and deception behind masks of modest compliance. The blood substitution method was equally elaborate, but less physically damaging. Women would obtain animal blood, usually from chickens, rabbits, or other small animals that were routinely butchered in medieval households. They would hide small containers of this blood in their clothing or jewelry, then secretly apply it to their bodies or bed sheets at crucial moments. This technique required careful timing and tremendous nerve. The blood had to be fresh enough to appear authentic, but not so fresh that it would clot or smell wrong to experienced examiners. Women had to learn the differences between various types of blood and how to make animal blood appear similar to human hymenal bleeding. Some women became expert at obtaining and preserving blood for these deceptions. They would coordinate with kitchen servants who could provide fresh animal blood from daily food preparation. They would experiment with different preservation methods to keep blood fluid and authentic looking for extended periods. The most complex deceptions involved timing, weddings, and examinations to coincide with women's menstrual cycles. This required intimate knowledge of their own bodies and the ability to manipulate social calendars to their advantage. Women had to understand exactly when they would be menstruating, and then influence the scheduling of important events to coincide with their natural bleeding. This timing strategy was risky, because experienced midwives could often distinguish between menstrual blood and hymenal bleeding. The color, consistency, and smell were different, but for women who had no other options, menstrual timing provided some cover for their deceptions. Perhaps the most extraordinary resistance strategy involved substitute brides, USS, having other women take the place of non-virgin brides during wedding night consummations or intimate examinations. This required incredible coordination and trust between women who were risking their lives to help each other. Substitute bride arrangements usually involved female relatives, close friends, or loyal servants who were willing to impersonate the actual bride during crucial moments. The logistics were enormously complex. The substitute had to be physically similar enough to pass casual inspection. She had to be coached on personal details that might come up during intimate conversations. She had to be prepared to convincingly play the role of a nervous virgin bride. The risks for everyone involved in substitute bride deceptions were enormous. If discovered, both the real bride and the substitute could face execution for fraud and deception. Male relatives who might have helped coordinate such arrangements could be accused of treason against their lords or kings. Yet historical records suggest that substitute bride arrangements occurred with surprising frequency, particularly among noble families where the political stakes were highest. Women were willing to risk death to help. Other women escaped the consequences of failed virginity tests. The technological aspects of these deceptions were sophisticated for their time. Women developed methods for creating artificial hymens using animal membranes, plant materials, and other substances that could be inserted into their bodies before examinations. These artificial barriers would break and bleed when examined, creating the appearance of intact virginity. Some women learned primitive surgical techniques for temporarily reconstructing damaged hymens. Using needles, thread, and various healing substances, they could create scar tissue that might fool casual examination. These procedures were extremely dangerous and painful, but they offered hope for women who had no other options. The knowledge required for these medical deceptions was passed down through informal networks of women who shared information about anatomy, healing, and surgical techniques. This represented a form of underground medical education that existed entirely outside official channels and was focused specifically on helping women survive the virginity testing system. Women also developed sophisticated methods for controlling their emotional and physical reactions during examinations. They learned meditation and breathing techniques that could help them remain calm during traumatic procedures. They practiced maintaining neutral facial expressions and controlling their body language to avoid giving examiners additional information about their experiences. Some women became expert at manipulating the psychological aspects of examination situations. They learned how to present themselves as ideal virgin subjects, modest, innocent, fearful in exactly the right amounts. They understood that examiners were looking for specific behavioral cues as well as physical evidence, and they learned to perform virginity as convincingly as they faked physical proof. The economic aspects of resistance networks were also significant. Women who had resources would sometimes pay for elaborate deception services provided by other women who specialized in helping people pass virginity tests. These underground service providers offered everything from blood supplies to medical procedures to coaching on examination techniques. Some midwives secretly operated as resistance organizers, using their official positions to help women while appearing to serve the system that oppressed them. These double agents would provide women with information about upcoming examinations, advice on deception techniques, and sometimes even falsified examination results when they could get away with it. The religious dimensions of resistance were particularly complex. Some women found ways to use medieval Christianity's emphasis on mercy and forgiveness to justify their deceptions. They argued that God would understand their need to lie in order to survive unjust treatment. Others developed private religious practices that helped them maintain their sense of dignity and worth, despite the degradations they endured. Female religious communities, convents, and other women's religious organizations sometimes served as informal resistance networks. Nuns and other religious women would provide advice, shelter, and practical assistance to women fleeing the consequences of failed virginity tests. These religious communities offered one of the few spaces in medieval society where women could operate with some degree of independence from male authority. The documentation of resistance activities reveals how carefully women had to guard their secrets. Most evidence of deception networks comes from court records of cases where women were caught and punished. The successful deceptions, and there must have been many of them, left no historical traces because their success depended on complete secrecy. The international scope of resistance networks matched the international scope of virginity testing itself. Women in different countries shared information and techniques across national boundaries. Marriage negotiations between kingdoms sometimes involved coordination between women on both sides to ensure that brides would pass examination requirements. The psychological impact of participating in resistance networks was complex. On one hand, working to help other women provided a sense of agency and purpose that helped women maintain their dignity in a dehumanizing system. On the other hand, the constant fear of discovery and the knowledge that they were engaged in activities that could result in execution created enormous stress and anxiety. Some women became professional resistors, developing reputations as people who could help other women survive virginity testing. These specialists operated in the shadows of medieval society, providing services that were simultaneously essential and illegal. They developed expertise in medical deception, psychological manipulation, and logistical coordination that rivaled anything available through official channels. The courage required for these resistance activities cannot be overstated. Women who participated in deception networks were risking torture, execution, and the destruction of their families' reputations. They were challenging not just social customs, but fundamental assumptions about male authority and female submission that were considered divinely ordained. Now let's examine how virginity testing became one of the most powerful political weapons in medieval Europe. This wasn't just about individual women's reputations or family honor. These examinations were tools of international diplomacy, warfare, and power politics that could determine the fate of entire kingdoms. Understanding the political dimensions of virginity testing requires recognizing that medieval Europe was essentially a network of family businesses where royal marriages were corporate mergers designed to combine resources, territory, and political influence. When a princess married a foreign prince, she wasn't just becoming a wife, she was becoming a human treaty that sealed agreements between nations. The economic stakes involved in these royal marriages were absolutely staggering. We're talking about dowries that would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money, territorial exchanges that could double or halve a kingdom's size, trade agreements that controlled the flow of wealth across continents, military alliances that could determine who lived and died in wars involving hundreds of thousands of people. All of this depended on the marriage being accepted as legitimate by both sides and by other European powers. And in medieval thinking, legitimacy required that the bride be a proven virgin whose children would unquestionably belong to her husband's bloodline. This created a situation where women's hymens became the foundation of international commerce and diplomacy. The condition of a small piece of tissue could determine whether massive contracts would be honored, whether armies would march, and whether kingdoms would prosper or collapse. Let me give you a specific example of how this worked. When Catherine of Aragon married Prince Arthur of England in 1501, her dowry included not just money and jewels, but territorial claims in Spain, exclusive trading rights for English merchants, and military commitments from Spanish forces. The marriage represented years of careful negotiation between two of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. When Arthur died just months after the wedding, Catherine's virginity became a crucial political question. If she had consummated her marriage to Arthur, then her subsequent marriage to Henry VIII might be considered invalid under church law. This would nullify all the agreements that had been made as part of her original marriage contract. The Spanish were desperate to maintain their alliance with England, so they insisted that Catherine remained a virgin after her marriage to Arthur. The English initially accepted this claim because they wanted to keep Catherine's dowry and maintain their Spanish alliance. But decades later, when Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine to marry Anne Boleyn, her virginity became a weapon he could use to challenge the legitimacy of their marriage. Henry's campaign against Catherine demonstrates how virginity testing became a tool of international warfare. He assembled teams of theologians, lawyers, and medical experts from across Europe to examine the evidence of Catherine's sexual history. He commissioned detailed studies of her wedding night with Arthur, gathered testimony from servants who had been present, and even had physicians examine Catherine's body multiple times over several years. The political implications extended far beyond England and Spain. Catherine's nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, controlled vast territories across Europe and threatened war against England if Henry succeeded in divorcing his aunt. The Pope faced enormous pressure from both sides and eventually had to choose between maintaining England's loyalty to the Catholic Church or satisfying Spanish political demands. This single woman's hymen became the center of a diplomatic crisis that affected the balance of power across Europe. Religious wars, territorial disputes, and trade conflicts all traced back to questions about whether Catherine of Aragon had been a virgin when she married Henry VIII. Similar patterns played out repeatedly across medieval Europe. Royal virginity tests became weapons that could be deployed strategically to challenge inconvenient marriages, eliminate rival claimants to thrones, or justify aggressive military actions. Kings who wanted to divorce their wives would suddenly develop concerns about their virginity that had never bothered them during years of marriage. Accusations of lost virginity could destroy political alliances that had become inconvenient or expensive. Failed virginity tests provided legal justifications for seizing property, breaking contracts, and declaring wars. The international nature of these political marriages meant that virginity testing results in one country could trigger responses across multiple kingdoms. When a royal bride failed examination in her new homeland, it reflected negatively on her birth country's ability to provide suitable marriage partners. This could damage a kingdom's reputation and reduce its ability to negotiate future alliances. Some kingdoms developed reputations for producing particularly pure or impure royal brides. Countries that had multiple royal daughters fail virginity tests found it increasingly difficult to arrange advantageous marriages for their remaining princesses. This created competitive pressure between kingdoms to develop better methods for ensuring their daughters would pass examination. The documentation requirements for politically important virginity tests were extensive and meticulous. Results had to be recorded by multiple witnesses, certified by religious authorities, and preserved in royal archives where they could be referenced for decades or centuries. These records became legal documents that could be cited in international court proceedings. The timing of political virginity tests was often carefully calculated to maximize their impact on ongoing diplomatic negotiations. A failed test could be used to justify breaking off marriage negotiations at crucial moments, forcing rival kingdoms to make concessions or accept unfavorable terms. Some royal courts developed intelligence networks specifically focused on gathering information about the virginity and sexual behavior of foreign princesses. Spies would infiltrate rival courts, bribe servants, and cultivate sources who could provide intimate details about potential marriage partners before formal negotiations began. This intelligence gathering created an international market in information about royal women's bodies. Professional spies specialized in seducing servants who had access to princesses' private quarters. Diplomats would pay substantial sums for reliable information about foreign royal daughters' sexual experiences. The psychological warfare aspects of political virginity testing were deliberate and sophisticated. The threat of examination was often more powerful than actual testing, because it created constant anxiety and compliance among royal women. Princesses who knew they might be tested at any time modified their behavior to avoid any activity that might cast doubt on their purity. This psychological control extended beyond the women being tested to their families and supporters. Parents of royal daughters lived in constant fear that their children might do something that would damage their reputations and therefore their political value. This created networks of surveillance and control that monitored every aspect of royal women's lives. The military implications of virginity testing results could be enormous. Failed tests could be used to justify breaking defensive alliances, leaving kingdoms vulnerable to attack. Successful tests could legitimize territorial claims or provide moral justification for military campaigns against rivals. Some wars were literally fought over disputes that began with questions about royal women's virginity. When examination results were challenged or disputed, the conflicts could escalate into full-scale military confrontations involving multiple countries and lasting for years or decades. The economic calculations behind political virginity testing reveal the cold, mechanical nature of medieval diplomacy. Court officials developed detailed formulas for determining when the political benefits of testing outweighed the costs and risks. These calculations treated women's dignity and suffering as acceptable costs in pursuit of political advantage. The legal frameworks that supported political virginity testing created precedents that influenced international law for centuries. Courts developed procedures for conducting examinations, evaluating evidence, and determining appropriate responses to different results. These legal structures institutionalized the treatment of women's bodies as political resources. The religious dimensions of political virginity testing were particularly complex because they involved competing claims about divine authority and moral legitimacy. Different kingdoms would cite religious authorities to support their interpretations of examination results, creating theological disputes that paralleled political conflicts. The technological innovations in political virginity testing reveal how much intellectual and financial resources were devoted to perfecting these procedures. Royal courts invested in developing new examination techniques, training specialized personnel, and creating documentation systems that could withstand international scrutiny. The international standardization of virginity testing procedures shows how coordinated these practices became across different kingdoms. European courts shared information about examination techniques, compared results using similar criteria, and developed common standards for evaluating and documenting test outcomes. The diplomatic protocols surrounding political virginity tests were elaborate and formal. There were specific procedures for requesting examinations, appointing examiners, conducting tests, and communicating results between kingdoms. These protocols treated women's bodies as diplomatic territory that required careful negotiation to access. The aftermath management of political virginity testing results involved complex strategies for minimizing or maximizing their impact, depending on political goals. Courts developed sophisticated methods for presenting results in ways that supported their desired outcomes, while maintaining plausible claims to objectivity and legitimacy. As we near the end of our journey through this dark chapter of history, I want to talk about something that might shock you. Many of these practices didn't just disappear when the medieval period ended. The ideas and attitudes that justified virginity testing in medieval Europe continue to influence how women's bodies are treated around the world today. This isn't just ancient history that we can safely file away as things people used to do in the bad old days. The fundamental assumptions that drove medieval virginity testing, that women's bodies are appropriate subjects for male control, that female sexuality is inherently dangerous and needs to be monitored, and that women's value depends on their sexual purity. These ideas persist in various forms across many cultures today. Let me give you some modern examples that will help you understand how directly connected these historical practices are to contemporary issues. Virginity testing still occurs in many countries today. In some places, it's legally sanctioned and conducted by medical professionals. In others, it happens informally within families or communities that maintain traditional beliefs about female purity. The techniques may have evolved. Modern virginity testing often uses medical instruments and claims scientific authority, but the fundamental violation remains the same. Women and girls are still being subjected to intimate examinations designed to determine their sexual history, and the results still determine their social status, marriage prospects, and sometimes their physical safety. The World Health Organization, UN Women, and the UN Human Rights Council have all condemned virginity testing as a form of violence against women that violates human rights. In 2018, these organizations issued a joint statement calling for the elimination of virginity testing worldwide. But the fact that such statements are necessary in the 21st century shows how persistent these medieval ideas have proven to be. What's particularly disturbing is that virginity testing continues to happen, even in countries with advanced medical systems and strong legal protections for women's rights. In the United States, for example, there is no federal law prohibiting virginity testing, and some doctors still perform these examinations at the request of parents or other family members. The medical profession's relationship with virginity testing reveals how deeply embedded these medieval attitudes became in healthcare systems. For centuries, medical education included training in virginity testing techniques. Medical textbooks describe these procedures as legitimate diagnostic tools. Physicians developed professional expertise in examining women's bodies for evidence of sexual activity. This medical legitimization of intimate control over women's bodies created institutional structures that persist today in modified forms. The idea that women's reproductive systems are appropriate subjects for investigation by male medical authorities became deeply embedded in healthcare culture and continues to influence medical practice in subtle but important ways. The legal frameworks that once supported systematic examination of women's bodies also evolved rather than disappeared. Modern legal systems still contain elements that treat women's sexual behavior as matters of public concern rather than private choice. Laws about sexual conduct, reproductive rights, and domestic relations often reflect assumptions about female sexuality that trace back to medieval thinking. The psychological patterns displayed by victims of modern virginity testing are identical to those documented in medieval sources. Contemporary women who undergo these examinations report the same trauma, shame, disconnection from their bodies, and difficulty forming intimate relationships that medieval chroniclers described centuries ago. This consistency across time and cultures suggests that the harm caused by virginity testing isn't just a product of medieval ignorance, primitive medical knowledge. The damage comes from the fundamental violation of treating women's bodies as objects for inspection and control, rather than recognizing them as human beings with inherent dignity and autonomy. The resistance strategies developed by contemporary women fighting against virginity testing also follow patterns established by their medieval predecessors. Modern activists use many of the same arguments, face similar obstacles, and employ comparable tactics to those developed by medieval women trying to protect themselves and others. The international human rights movement's campaign against virginity testing represents a direct challenge to ideas and practices that dominated European culture for centuries. When human rights organizations argue that women have the right to control their own bodies and make their own decisions about sexuality, they're rejecting fundamental assumptions of medieval society. But the persistence of virginity testing in various forms around the world demonstrates how deeply these medieval ideas became embedded in human culture. The assumption that women's sexual purity is a matter of public concern rather than private experience continues to influence law, medicine, and social policy in many societies. The economic dimensions of modern virginity testing also echo medieval patterns. In cultures where virginity testing still occurs, women's marriage prospects and economic opportunities often depend on the results. The commodification of female purity that characterized medieval royal marriages continues in different forms wherever women's sexual history affects their social and economic status. The religious justifications for modern virginity testing frequently cite the same theological arguments that medieval Christians used to justify their practices. The idea that God designed women's bodies to reveal their moral condition, that sexual purity reflects spiritual worth, and that examining women's bodies serves divine purposes. These beliefs persist in various religious communities today. The technological evolution of virginity testing shows how these practices adapt to new circumstances while maintaining their essential character. Modern examinations may use sophisticated medical equipment and claim scientific authority, but they serve the same fundamental purpose of asserting male control over female sexuality that drove medieval testing. The educational implications of understanding this historical continuity are enormous. Teaching people about the medieval origins of virginity testing helps them recognize these practices as historical artifacts of patriarchal control rather than legitimate medical procedures or religious requirements. The feminist movement's analysis of virginity testing as a form of sexual violence draws direct connections between medieval practices and contemporary gender-based violence. Understanding these historical roots helps explain why eliminating virginity testing requires challenging deeply embedded cultural assumptions about women's roles and rights. The international scope of modern virginity testing mirrors the international networks that supported these practices in medieval Europe. Just as medieval courts shared information and techniques across national boundaries, contemporary virginity testing occurs within global networks of cultural exchange that perpetuate and refine these violations. The documentation practices surrounding modern virginity testing often echo medieval precedents in their clinical detachment and systematic recording of intimate violations. Medical records, legal proceedings, and administrative documents continue to treat women's bodies as sources of evidence rather than sites of human experience. The political uses of virginity testing accusations in contemporary conflicts also follow medieval patterns. Authoritarian governments use allegations about women's sexual behavior to discredit political opponents. Military forces use sexual violence and purity testing as weapons of war. Political movements mobilize anxieties about female sexuality to gain support for repressive policies. The psychological research on trauma and recovery has helped modern societies understand the lasting damage caused by virginity testing in ways that medieval people couldn't comprehend. But this scientific knowledge about harm hasn't been sufficient to eliminate practices that serve powerful political and social functions. The cultural normalization of virginity testing in many societies shows how effectively these practices can be integrated into social systems that present them as normal, necessary, and beneficial. Just as medieval Europeans saw nothing wrong with examining royal women's bodies, many contemporary cultures treat virginity testing as an appropriate response to legitimate concerns about family honor and social stability. The economic incentives that support modern virginity testing include not just the direct costs of examinations, but the entire economic system that rewards women for sexual purity and punishes them for sexual autonomy. These economic structures create powerful pressures that maintain virginity testing even when people recognize its harmful effects. The stories of individual women who have survived modern virginity testing echo the experiences of their medieval predecessors in remarkable ways. The courage, intelligence, and dignity that contemporary survivors display mirrors the strength shown by women like Blanche of Navarre, Catherine of Aragon, and Joan of Arc centuries ago. As we reach the end of this difficult but important journey through one of history's darkest chapters, I want you to take a moment to reflect on what we've learned together. We've explored the systematic torture and humiliation that medieval women endured in the name of purity, politics, and power. We've seen how queens and princesses were reduced to objects for examination by men who claimed to serve higher purposes while violating the most basic principles of human dignity. The stories we've uncovered today aren't just historical curiosities or examples of how backward people used to be. They're windows into the fundamental structures of power and control that have shaped women's experiences for centuries. They help us understand how societies can normalize and institutionalize the most horrific practices when those practices serve the interests of people in power. When Blanche of Navarre stood naked and trembling in that cold stone chamber in 1453, she wasn't just enduring a personal ordeal. She was experiencing the logical endpoint of a social system that treated women as property, to be evaluated, tested, and controlled by others. Her suffering was systematic, legal, and considered perfectly normal by her society. But her survival was also an act of resistance. Every woman who endured these examinations and lived to tell about it was proving that human dignity could persist even in the face of systematic dehumanization. Their courage in the darkest moments continues to inspire people who fight against injustice today. The examination rooms where these women suffered have long since crumbled to dust. The men who ordered their violations have been forgotten by history. But the ideas that justified these practices persist in various forms around the world today. Understanding where these ideas came from helps us recognize them when they appear in contemporary disguises. The medical professionals who claimed scientific authority for their examinations weren't that different from modern authorities who used their expertise to justify controlling women's bodies. The political leaders who used virginity testing as weapons weren't that different from contemporary politicians who mobilize anxieties about female sexuality to gain support for repressive policies. The lesson isn't that we've made no progress since medieval times. We've made enormous progress in recognizing women's rights, developing medical knowledge, and creating legal protections for human dignity. But we've also seen how persistent and adaptable systems of oppression can be when they serve powerful interests. The women who developed resistance networks in medieval Europe weren't that different from contemporary activists who worked to eliminate virginity testing and other forms of gender-based violence. They faced similar obstacles, used comparable tactics, and showed the same courage in challenging systems that seemed unbreakable. This historical perspective helps us understand that the fight for women's rights isn't a recent development or a modern Western invention. Women have been resisting patriarchal control for as long as patriarchal systems have existed. The forms of resistance change, but the fundamental struggle for autonomy and dignity remains constant across cultures and centuries. The international scope of medieval virginity testing also reminds us that gender-based violence isn't limited to particular cultures or religions. Every society has developed its own methods for controlling women's sexuality, and every society has produced women who fought back against those methods. So, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we honor the memory of women like Blanche of Navarre, Catherine of Aragon, and Joan of Arc, while working to ensure that contemporary women don't face similar violations? First, we educate ourselves and others about the historical roots of practices that continue today. When we understand that virginity testing isn't a legitimate medical procedure or religious requirement, but a historical method of patriarchal control, we're better equipped to challenge it wherever it appears. Second, we support organizations that work to eliminate virginity testing and other forms of gender-based violence. The UN agencies, human rights groups, and feminist organizations that campaign against these practices are continuing the work that medieval women began when they created their own networks of resistance and support. Third, we recognize that eliminating virginity testing requires more than just changing laws or medical practices. It requires challenging the fundamental assumptions about women's sexuality, autonomy, and value that make these practices seem reasonable to people who support them. Fourth, we listen to and amplify the voices of women who have survived virginity testing and other forms of gender-based violence. Their experiences and insights are crucial for developing effective strategies for prevention and response. Finally, we remember that this work is ongoing and necessary. The medieval women whose stories we've explored today didn't have the benefit of international human rights law, modern medical knowledge, or global communication networks, but they still found ways to resist and survive. We have resources and opportunities that they couldn't imagine, which means we have even greater responsibility to continue their work. If you've made it this far in our exploration of this difficult topic, you're clearly someone who cares about understanding history and learning from it. I want to challenge you to take that concern beyond passive learning into active engagement. Share this video with people who might learn from it. Start conversations about how historical practices like virginity testing connect to contemporary issues. Support organizations that work to protect women's rights and eliminate gender-based violence. Use your voice, your vote, and your resources to challenge systems that treat women as objects for control rather than human beings with inherent dignity. The examination chambers where medieval women suffered are gone, but the struggle for human dignity continues. Every time we challenge assumptions about women's sexuality, every time we support survivors of gender-based violence, every time we refuse to accept that controlling women's bodies is normal or necessary, we're honoring the memory of those medieval women who endured unimaginable violations while maintaining their humanity. Before you go, make sure you hit that like button if this video taught you something new or changed how you think about history. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss future explorations of hidden historical truths. And drop a comment below to let me know what you thought about this topic and what other historical subjects you'd like me to investigate. Remember, the stories of the past aren't just entertainment. They're tools for understanding the present and building a better future. The medieval queens whose suffering we've explored today deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as human beings whose courage and dignity shine across the centuries to inspire us in our own struggles for justice and equality. Their voices echo across time, reminding us that human dignity is always worth defending, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against it. Let's make sure their sacrifices weren't in vain by continuing the fight they began so many centuries ago. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but important journey through history's shadows. Until next time, Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep fighting for a world where no woman has to endure what these medieval queens suffered in silence.